Chapter 1. The Ghost of the Silver Moon. Since the night the blood moon pack burned my family's legacy to ash, I have existed as a shadow among the living. The air in the Silver Moon Tavern always tastes of stale ale and the metallic tang of wet fur, a scent that sticks to the back of my throat like a curse. I wiped the scarred mahogany bar for the 10th time, my movements rhythmic and robotic, because any break in the routine would invite the pack's unwanted attention. Around me, the room hummed with the aggressive vitality of wolves who viewed my presence as a smudge on their pristine territory. Every clink of a glass or barked laugh felt like a physical blow against my ribs, yet I remained anchored to my post. Survival in this pack isn't about strength. It's about becoming so insignificant that the predators forget you're even there. Because I was born an Omega in a lineage of fallen elites, my very breath is considered an affront to the current hierarchy. I watched from the corner of my eye as a group of high-ranking she-wolves huddled at a central table, their eyes darting toward me with a predatory gleam. They were the daughters of the men who had dismantled my life, girls who wore silk and arrogance like armor while I wore grease and silence. The tallest of them, Celine, leaned back and whispered something that erupted into a jagged chorus of giggles. I knew that sound. It was the precursor to a hunt, and tonight I was the designated prey. Why do those with everything feel the need to strip away the nothingness left to those they've already broken? It's a question that keeps me awake when the moon is high and my room is cold. Drawing a deep breath, I tried to focus on the grime beneath my fingernails, but the heavy oak doors of the tavern swung open with a force that silenced the entire hall. The atmosphere shifted instantly, the temperature seemingly dropping 10 degrees as the crowd parted like a retreating tide. He walked in, his presence a dark sun that pulled every scrap of light toward his towering frame. Alpha Kael didn't just occupy space. He dominated it with a ruthless, silent authority that made even the most boisterous warriors lower their heads. His scent hit me before his gaze did. Forest floor after a storm, cedar wood, and a hint of something ancient and dangerous. My heart hammered against my sternum, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone, as I realized the she-wolves were looking between him and me. "Hey, Omega!" Selena's voice cut through the silence, sharp and demanding as she gestured toward the head table where Kael was seated. "We've been discussing your lack of hospitality tonight, and we think you should go show our Alpha some proper respect." The dare hung in the air, thick and suffocating as the other wolves began to murmur and nudge each other in anticipation. They expected me to cower or beg for a different task, but a sudden hot spark of defiance flickered in the pit of my stomach. If I was going to be destroyed, I wouldn't let it happen while I was hiding behind a bar rag. I dropped the cloth, my hands trembling only slightly as I stepped out from the safety of the counter. Every eye followed me, 100 pairs of predatory orbs waiting for the moment the Alpha would tear me apart for my insolence. My boots sounded like thunderclaps on the wooden floorboards, each step taking me closer to the man who represented everything I should fear. Kael hadn't looked up yet, his large hand wrapped around a heavy tankard, his shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the entire world. I reached the edge of his table, the air vibrating with a strange, electric tension that made the hair on my arms stand up. I didn't stop until I was standing directly beside him, the heat radiating from his body making my skin prickle with an unfamiliar intensity. He slowly turned his head, his profile carved from granite and shadowed by a week's worth of dark stubble. When his eyes finally met mine, the world didn't just stop. It shattered into a million jagged pieces. Something deep inside me, a part of my soul that had been dormant for years, suddenly lurched to life with a violent, agonizing pull. It was as if a silver cord had been tightened between our chests, dragging us together with a force that defied gravity and logic. My wolf, who I thought had abandoned me the day my parents died, let out a piercing howl that echoed through my mind. This couldn't be happening. The universe couldn't be this cruel to pair a discarded orphan with the man destined to lead her oppressors. Kael's hand tightened on the glass until the thick material began to spiderweb with cracks, his pupils blowing wide until his eyes were nothing but endless, terrifying voids. "You shouldn't exist," he whispered, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that I felt in my very marrow. The rejection in his tone should have been the final blow, yet the bond continued to pulse, demanding I reach out and touch the monster before me. I stood frozen, caught between the urge to run and the desperate, illogical need to sink into his shadow. The tavern was gone, the mocking wolves were gone, and there was only this impossible, suffocating connection. Have you ever felt the exact moment your fate was sealed by a person who hated the very sight of you? That was the moment I realized the ghost of the silver moon was about to be pulled back into the light, whether she wanted to be or not. Chapter 2. The Alpha's Curse. The mark on my soul flared with a sudden, agonizing heat that threatened to incinerate my composure in front of the entire pack. I stared at the girl, the scrawny, hollow-eyed Omega who was supposed to be nothing more than a footnote in my reign. For years, I had prepared myself for the moment I would find my mate, imagining a female of high standing and fierce strength. Instead, the moon goddess had seen fit to tether me to a broken relic of a traitorous line, a girl who looked like a stiff breeze would snap her in two. The irony was a bitter pill that coated my tongue in copper, making it hard to draw a clean breath. Because our pack laws are written in blood and tradition, a mate like her was a liability I could ill afford in these turbulent times. I watched her through the haze of the bond, noticing the way her pulse throbbed in the hollow of her throat, a frantic, rhythmic tapping that called to my inner wolf. My beast was pacing behind my ribs, snarling and scratching to get to her, to claim what the stars had promised us. I forced my fingers to stay wrapped around the breaking glass, fighting the instinct to reach out and bruise her pale skin with my touch. The room was watching, a sea of expectant faces, waiting for me to assert my dominance or cast her aside like the refuse she was. My father's voice echoed in the back of my mind, reminding me that weakness is a contagion that must be cauterized before it spreads. "Remove her," I growled, the command tearing through my throat with more ferocity than I intended. Two warriors stepped forward, their movements hesitant as they sensed the volatile energy rolling off me in waves. Zara, that was her name, a name I had tried to forget, didn't move, her defiant gaze still locked onto mine even as her body shook. She was a contradiction of fragility and steel, a girl who had lost everything but still carried herself with the ghost of a queen's grace. As the warriors reached for her arms, the bond snapped tight, a physical jolt of pain lancing through my chest at the thought of them laying hands on her. I slammed my glass onto the table, the shards flying like diamonds in the dim light, and the warriors froze mid-step. "I said remove her," I repeated, my voice dropping to a dangerous, vibrating hush that sent a ripple of fear through the tavern. I watched them lead her away, her small form swallowed by the shadows of the hallway, yet the connection didn't fade with the distance. I could feel her terror, a cold, sharp sensation that mirrored the ice creeping into my own heart. The air in the room felt stagnant now, stripped of the electric charge she had brought with her, leaving me alone with a hunger I didn't recognize. Why does the heart crave the very thing that is destined to destroy its peace? I stood up, the chair scraping harshly against the floor, and walked out of the tavern without looking back at my bewildered pack. The cool night air did little to settle the riot in my blood as I paced the perimeter of the Alpha house, my senses dialed to an impossible frequency. I could hear her breathing in the servants' quarters, a shallow, uneven sound that made my own lungs ache in sympathy. The bond was a living thing, a parasite that had attached itself to my spirit, feeding on my frustration and my desire. I knew her history, the daughter of a man who had nearly brought this pack to ruin, and yet, my wolf only cared about the scent of rain and starlight that clung to her. This was a test, a cruel joke played by the heavens to see if I would choose my duty, or a girl who was the personification of my pack's shame. I found myself standing outside the door to her meager room before I even realized I had moved, my hand hovering over the wood. Behind this door was the catalyst for my downfall, the one person who could make me turn my back on everything I had built. I could feel her anger through the door, a sharp, jagged emotion that lashed out at me, refusing to be subdued. She was rejecting the bond just as fiercely as I was, a realization that stung more than any physical wound I had ever sustained. I leaned my forehead against the cool timber, listening to the silence of a woman who was slowly becoming my entire world. "Stay away from me, Zara," I whispered to the wood, knowing she could hear me with her newly awakened senses. "Stay away, or I won't stop myself next time." The warning was as much for me as it was for her, a desperate plea to the universe to keep us apart before the fire consumed us both. I could feel her standing on the other side, her warmth seeping through the door, tempting me to break it down and claim her right there. But I was an alpha, and an alpha does not surrender to a feeling that threatens the stability of his people. I turned away, the silver cord stretching but never breaking, leaving me to wonder how long a man can fight against the tide before he is finally pulled under. Chapter 3. The weight of the blood morning arrived with a cruel gray light that filtered through the cracks in my ceiling, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the cold air. I lay on my thin mattress, my body feeling as though it had been dragged through a thicket of thorns. The bond was no longer a silent spark, it was a constant, low-frequency hum that vibrated in my bones, tethering me to a man who had just threatened my life. I touched my neck, the skin there feeling sensitized and raw, though no mark had been made yet. He had been so close, his scent filling my senses until I forgot how to be the invisible ghost I had spent years perfecting. Because the pack had witnessed our collision, the atmosphere in the servants' kitchen was thick with a new kind of hostility, a mixture of awe and resentment. Nobody spoke to me, but the weight of their stares was heavy enough to bruise, their whispers following me like a swarm of angry bees. I was no longer just the useless Omega. I was the Alpha's mistake, a glitch in the system that everyone wanted to see corrected. I grabbed a heavy bucket of water, the iron handle biting into my palm, and headed toward the laundry courtyard. Physical labor was the only thing that could drown out the chaotic thoughts swirling in my head, the only way to remind myself that I was still in control of my own limbs. As I scrubbed the heavy linens, my mind drifted back to the stories my father used to tell me about the bond, about how it was supposed to be a sacred union of two halves. He never mentioned that it could feel like a trap, or that it could link you to someone who viewed you as a plague. A sudden flash of memory hit me, a vision of my father's face as he stood before the previous council, his voice steady even as they stripped him of his rank. He had been accused of a betrayal I knew he was incapable of, a lie that had ended in fire and blood. If Kael was the one who now held the power my father lost, how could I ever look at him without seeing the ghosts of my past? "You're working too hard, little wolf," a voice drawled from the doorway, breaking my concentration and making me splash soapy water onto my boots. It was Silas, one of the Alpha's younger brothers, a man who possessed Kael's height, but none of his brooding intensity. He leaned against the stone archway, a playful smirk dancing on his lips, yet his eyes remained sharp and observant. He was the only one who didn't look at me with disgust, but I knew better than to trust a wolf with a smile. In this world, a smile was often just a precursor to a bite, and I had no intention of being anyone's snack. I went back to my scrubbing, my movements deliberate and sharp, ignoring the way he stepped into my personal space. "My brother is in a foul mood this morning," Silas continued, unbothered by my silence as he toyed with a loose thread on his tunic. "He's been tearing through the training grounds like a man possessed, and everyone knows why. You've done something to him, Zara." "I haven't done anything but exist," I snapped, the words coming out more heated than I intended. "If your brother can't handle the consequences of his own territory, that's his problem." Silas chuckled, a low melodic sound that seemed out of place in the grim courtyard, and he stepped closer until I could smell the faint scent of ozone on him. "It's not just about territory, and you know it. The bond is a powerful thing, but in this pack, it can also be a death sentence." His words sent a chill down my spine, a reminder that my new status didn't come with protection. It came with a target. The Council would never allow an Omega with a tainted bloodline to stand beside the Alpha, especially one as powerful as Kael. I looked up at Silas, my eyes searching his for any sign of a hidden agenda, but I found only a strange, unsettling pity. I didn't want his pity. and I certainly didn't want his brother's conflict. I wanted the life I had before the world realized I was still breathing. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper as the gravity of my situation finally began to sink in. "Because," he said, his expression turning serious for the first time, "Kael isn't the only one watching you, and some of those eyes aren't as conflicted as his. You need to decide if you're going to be a victim or a player in this game, because the middle ground is a very dangerous place to be." He left me then, his departure as sudden as his arrival, leaving me alone with the wet laundry and a heart that refused to stop racing. I looked toward the Alpha House, the dark stone looming over the village like a silent sentinel, and I felt the bond pull again. A steady, demanding tug. Kael was there, probably staring out of a window and cursing the day I was born. Yet I could feel his pain as clearly as my own. It was a low, aching loneliness that mirrored the void in my own chest, a shared wound that neither of us knew how to heal. I realized then that my survival depended on more than just hiding. It depended on understanding the man who was now my greatest threat and my only hope. Chapter 4: The Invisible Tether. The dawn arrived not with light, but with a suffocating awareness that I was no longer the mistress of my own skin. Because the bond had fully anchored itself into my nervous system overnight, every muscle in my body felt pulled toward the north side of the packlands where Kael's scent hung heaviest. I sat on the edge of my cot, clutching my elbows as a phantom heat crawled up my spine, a sensation that felt like a warm hand trailing over my vertebrae. It wasn't just a feeling, it was a physical invasion, a psychic tether that broadcasted his restless energy directly into my brain. He was awake, he was pacing, and he was drowning in a sea of agitation that tasted like ozone and scorched earth. I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling as I fought the instinct to run straight into the jaws of the wolf who had told me I shouldn't exist. My reflection in the cracked mirror showed a girl I barely recognized. Her eyes were too bright, her skin flushed with a fever that no medicine could break. The mark of the mate bond was an invisible brand, yet I felt it glowing like a beacon for every predator in the Blood Moon pack to see. How do you hide a fire when you are the fuel? I splashed freezing water on my face, gasping as the shock momentarily dulled the thrumming in my blood. But the relief was as fleeting as a summer breeze. Stepping out into the communal hallway, I felt the atmosphere shift from the cold indifference of yesterday to a sharp, jagged hostility that cut through my clothes. The Omegas who used to share silent nods with me now scurried away, their heads bowed as if my presence were a contagious rot. I walked toward the kitchens, my chin held high because I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me crumble under the weight of their judgment. Every floorboard creaked with the secret history of this house, a place built on the bones of families like mine, and today, those bones felt restless. "Look at her," a voice hissed from the shadows of the pantry, the words dripping with a venom that made my stomach churn. "Thinking she's more than a tavern rat just because the Alpha's wolf has gone mad." I didn't turn around, but the air around me thickened, a sudden pressure building in the room that made the glass jars on the shelves rattle. My wolf, usually a silent spectator to my misery, let out a low, vibrating growl that echoed in the back of my skull. It wasn't just my anger. It was a reflection of Kael's protective instinct, bleeding through the connection. A terrifying realization that he could influence my very reactions. I clutched the edge of the prep table, my knuckles turning white as I fought to maintain a barrier between my mind and his. If I let him in, if I accepted the strength he was subconsciously offering, I would be surrendering the only thing I had left, my autonomy. Because I was distracted by the internal battle, I didn't notice the heavy silence that had fallen over the kitchen until the back door thudded shut. The heat returned, 10 times stronger than before, signaling his arrival long before he stepped into my line of sight. Kael stood in the doorway, his massive frame silhouetted by the morning sun, looking like a god of war who had forgotten how to find peace. His eyes found mine instantly, the gold in his iris swirling like a tempest, and the air in the kitchen vanished. The other servants scrambled out of the room, dropping knives and towels in their haste to escape the volatile energy radiating from their leader. "You're avoiding me," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards and up into the soles of my feet. "I'm doing exactly what you told me to do," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt as I grabbed a bowl of flour to justify my presence. "I'm staying away." He moved with a predatory grace that made my heart stutter, closing the distance between us until I was trapped between his heat and the cold stone of the table. He didn't touch me, but the proximity was a physical assault on my senses, the scent of cedar and storm clouds wrapping around me like a shroud. I could see the pulse jumping in his jaw, the raw conflict etched into every line of his face as he stared down at me. He looked like a man who wanted to break me and cherish me in the same breath, a duality that terrified me more than his rejection ever could. "The bond doesn't care about orders, Zara," he whispered, leaning down until his breath stirred the loose strands of hair at my temple. "It's pulling at my sanity, dragging me to you every second I'm away." I looked up at him, my defiance clashing with the desperate, soul-deep recognition that flared in his gaze. I wanted to tell him that I hated him, that I hated the pack that had murdered my joy, but the bond made the lie die in my throat. We were two broken pieces of a puzzle that didn't want to be solved, linked by a fate that neither of us had asked for. Have you ever been so close to your enemy that you could feel his heartbeat mimicking your own? I reached out, my hand trembling as it hovered near his chest, and for a heartbeat, the world was nothing but the two of us and the impossible gravity between us. Chapter 5: The Shards of the Past. The scent of her, lilies and old parchment, was a drug that bypassed my reason and went straight to the primal core of my beast. I stood in the kitchen, watching the play of light on Zara's pale skin, and felt the iron walls of my self-control beginning to rust and flake away. My wolf was screaming at me to claim her, to mark her and show the world that she belonged to the Alpha, but my mind was a battlefield of duty and heritage. Because I was the son of the man who had ordered the execution of her kin, every touch was a betrayal of my bloodline, and every look was a confession of guilt. I wanted to wrap my hands around her throat just as much as I wanted to bury my face in the crook of her neck. I saw the way she looked at me, the mixture of fear, hatred, and a burgeoning, unwanted desire that mirrored my own. She wasn't just a girl. She was a living reminder of the secrets my father had buried beneath the floorboards of the Alpha House. I had spent my life trying to be the perfect leader, the strong, unyielding hand that kept the Blood Moon pack together. But this tiny Omega was unraveling me with a single glance. I reached out, my fingers grazing the fabric of her sleeve, and a jolt of electricity shot through my arm that nearly brought me to my knees. The bond wasn't just a connection. It was a revelation. A window into her soul that showed me the depths of her loneliness. "Tell me to leave, Zara," I groaned, my forehead dropping to rest against hers as I fought the urge to taste the defiance on her lips. "Tell me you want me gone, and I'll try to find a way to sever this." "You know I can't," she whispered, her voice a jagged shard of glass that cut through my defenses. "I can feel your hunger, Kael. It's inside me." The admission broke something in me, a final dam bursting as I shifted my hand to cup the back of her neck, my thumb stroking the sensitive skin behind her ear. She gasped, a soft, broken sound that ignited a fire in my loins, and I pulled her closer until there was no air left between us. I could feel her father's ghost standing between us, a silent witness to my desecration of her grief. Yet I couldn't stop. I was a man starving in a desert, and she was the only drop of water for 1,000 miles. I tilted her head back, my eyes tracking the movement of her throat as she swallowed, and for a moment, I forgot about the council, the pack, and the laws of my ancestors. A sudden, sharp image flashed through our shared connection, a memory that wasn't mine. I saw a man with silver hair laughing as he swung a young Zara into the air, the sun catching the hidden locket around his neck. Then the scene shifted to fire, to screaming, and to the sight of my father's warriors breaking down a heavy oak door. I recoiled as if I had been burned, my breath coming in ragged gasps as the weight of the past slammed back into me. Zara stumbled back, her eyes wide with shock as she realized I had seen into her most private agony, her hand flying to her chest as if to protect her heart. "My father didn't kill them," she said, her voice shaking with a sudden, fierce conviction that made the hair on my neck stand up. "He was framed, Kael. He found out something he wasn't supposed to know, and they erased him for it." The words were a direct assault on the foundation of my reality, a claim that, if true, meant my entire life was built on a lie. Because my father had been the one to bring the evidence against hers, accepting her truth meant accepting his villainy. I wanted to roar at her, to call her a liar and a traitor's brat, but the bond hummed with the absolute, unshakable sincerity of her belief. I turned away from her, my hands shaking as I gripped the edge of the table, the wood groaning under my strength. The kitchen felt like a tomb now, the air heavy with the scent of old blood and new betrayal. "Don't speak of things you don't understand," I spat, though the venom lacked its usual sting, replaced by a hollow, gnawing doubt. I left her there, standing amongst the flour and the shadows, and strode out into the training grounds with a mind that was spiraling out of control. Every warrior I passed was a potential conspirator, every elder a keeper of secrets that could burn my world to the ground. I began to strike the training dummy, each blow a thunderous crack that echoed off the stone walls, but the rhythm did nothing to soothe the storm. I realized then that finding my mate wasn't a blessing. It was the first domino in a sequence that would end in the total destruction of the Blood Moon Pack. The question was, would I be the one to stop the fall, or would I be the one to push the final piece? Chapter 6. The Crack in the Armor. The revelation about my father's innocence had been a heavy secret I'd carried like a stone in my gut for years, but giving it to Kael felt like handing him a weapon. I spent the afternoon in a daze, my hands moving through the repetitive motions of mending torn tunics while my mind replayed the look of absolute horror on the Alpha's face. He hadn't known. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The great Kael, the ruthless leader of the most feared pack in the territory, was a puppet who didn't even know who was pulling his strings. Because the bond allowed me to feel his echoing doubt, I knew I had planted a seed of rebellion in the one heart that mattered. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, bloody streaks across the courtyard, I felt a shift in the pack's energy, a sharpening of the air that signaled a coming storm. The council members were arriving for their monthly summit, their black-cloaked figures moving like crows through the tall grass of the estate. These were the men who had signed the orders for my family's erasure, the architects of the misery that had become my daily bread. I watched them from the window of the sewing room, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, as I saw the head elder, Silas's father, stop to speak with Kael. The bond suddenly spiked with a cold, metallic fear that didn't belong to me, a sensation of being watched by eyes that saw only a tool to be used. Kael was standing on the veranda, his posture rigid and his scent masked by a thick layer of forced neutrality. But through the tether, I could feel him screaming. He was looking at the elder, but his mind was on the kitchen, on the memory of my father's face, and on the terrifying possibility that his hero was a murderer. I felt a surge of unexpected empathy for the man who was supposed to be my enemy, a softening of my edges that I hadn't authorized. How do you comfort the person who holds the keys to your cage when you're still trapped inside it? I slipped out of the room, my feet silent on the stone floors as I followed an impulse I couldn't explain, drawn toward the library where I knew Kael retreated when the world became too loud. The hallways were deserted, the pack huddling in the shadows to avoid the council's predatory gaze, giving me a rare moment of freedom. I reached the heavy mahogany doors of the library and hesitated, my hand hovering over the iron ring as the bond pulsed with a low, aching thrum. He was inside, and he was breaking. Pushing the door open, I found him slumped in a chair by the cold fireplace, his head in his hands and his crown discarded on the floor like a piece of junk. The room smelled of old paper and wood smoke, a sanctuary that felt more like a prison tonight. He didn't look up when I entered, but the air in the room seemed to settle, the frantic vibration of the bond smoothing out into a low, steady hum. I walked over to him, my movements slow and cautious, and stood before the man who could end my life with a single word. "You saw it too, didn't you?" I asked, my voice barely audible in the vast, silent room. The inconsistency in the records, the way the dates didn't line up with the accusations. He looked up then, his eyes bloodshot and haunted, the gold nearly extinguished by a sea of black despair. "My father gave his life for this pack, Zara. He told me your family were traitors who wanted to sell our secrets to the hunters. Everything I am is built on the belief that he was right." "Then why do you feel like you're dying?" I countered, stepping closer until I could feel the heat radiating from his skin. "Why is the bond showing me a man who knows he's standing on a foundation of lies?" He stood up suddenly, the chair tumbling backward, and grabbed my shoulders with a grip that was desperate rather than aggressive. We stood there in the dying light, a fallen Omega and a doubting Alpha, our souls entangled in a knot that neither of us could untie. I realized then that the war wasn't going to be fought on a battlefield with claws and teeth. It was going to be fought in the quiet corners of this house, with truths that were sharper than any blade. The bond flared one last time before the moon rose, a bright, blinding flash of white light that showed me a future I hadn't dared to imagine, one where we weren't just mates by fate, but allies by choice. But as the first howl of the council meeting echoed through the halls, I knew that the path to that future was paved with the bodies of the people we both used to love. Chapter 7. The Fragile Quiet. The dawn arrived with a deceptive stillness that settled over the packlands like a heavy wool blanket. I stood by the frosted window of the infirmary, my fingers tracing the jagged edge of a mortar and pestle as I watched the fog swallow the jagged tree line. Because the bond had transitioned from a violent pull into a constant low-frequency hum, I could feel Kael's presence in the Alpha house without even trying. He was awake, his mind a jagged landscape of tactical maps and moral rot, yet there was a new thread in our connection, a soft, tentative warmth that hadn't been there before. It felt like a hand resting lightly on my shoulder, a silent promise that for this hour, at least, I was safe. Since the moment in the library, the hierarchy of the Blood Moon pack had begun to feel like a garment that was 2 sizes too small. I moved through my chores with a newfound fluidity, no longer ducking my head when the senior warriors passed me in the corridors. They noticed the change, their eyes narrowing as they tried to reconcile my Omega status with the quiet authority that now radiated from my posture. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was observing, gathering the scattered pieces of a truth that had been shattered long before I was born. Every whispered conversation in the hallway, and every lingering look from the elders, became a clue in a game I was finally learning how to play. "You're thinking about him again?" a voice teased from the doorway, and I turned to see Silas leaning against the frame with a basket of dried herbs. "I'm thinking about the fact that the laundry is 3 days behind," I lied, though the heat rising in my cheeks betrayed the connection I couldn't hide. "And I'm thinking about why the council spent 4 hours in the Great Hall last night without the Alpha." Silas's smile didn't reach his eyes this time, his expression clouding with a shadow that made him look remarkably like his brother. He walked over and set the basket on the table, his movements deliberate and heavy with a weight he wasn't ready to share. "The council doesn't like questions, Zara. And they especially don't like the way Kael has been looking at the old records. They think he's catching a fever, the kind that only a silver blade can cure." The warning was a physical chill that raced down my spine, a reminder that my safety was tethered to a man who was walking a tightrope over an abyss. If Kael fell, I would be the first thing the pack discarded to appease the elders' wrath. I looked at Silas, searching for the mask he usually wore, but I found only a raw, jagged concern that made me realize how deep the rot truly went. Why do those in power fear the truth more than they fear the enemies at their gates? It's a sickness that consumes the heart of a pack until there's nothing left but bone and hunger. "He's protecting me, isn't he?" I whispered, the realization hitting me with a sudden, sharp clarity that made my breath hitch. "He's trying," Silas replied. turning to leave before the silence could become too heavy. But even an alpha can't stop the tide once the moon starts to pull. I watched him go, the bond suddenly spiking with a surge of protective fury that nearly knocked me off my feet. Kael was close, closer than he had been all morning, and he was angry. I stepped out into the courtyard just as a group of rogue wolves from the southern border were being led in, their eyes wild and their scent thick with the metallic tang of blood. One of them, a scarred brute with a sneer that promised violence, lunged toward me as I crossed the path, his fingers reaching for the collar of my tunic. Before his hand could make contact, a blur of gray and black intercepted him with a force that cracked the stone beneath their feet. Kael was there, his hand wrapped around the rogue's throat, his eyes glowing with a feral golden light that demanded submission. The air around them vibrated with the intensity of his power, a suffocating pressure that made the other wolves fall to their knees in instinctive terror. He didn't look at me, but the bond was a roaring fire, a wall of heat and iron that stood between me and the world. I saw the muscles in his back bunch as he prepared to snap the rogue's neck, his wolf pushing through the surface with a hunger that was terrifying to behold. "Touch her!" Kael growled, his voice a low, vibrating snarl that echoed off the courtyard walls. "And you die."
Chapter 8. The Weight of the Crown. The heat of her skin was the only thing keeping me grounded as the world outside the Alpha House descended into a chaos of whispers and shadow. I sat in my father's old study, the scent of his cigars still clinging to the heavy velvet curtains, and felt the walls closing in on me. Because the council had begun to bypass my authority in the border disputes, I knew my time as a leader was being measured in heartbeats. Every report I read, and every order I gave felt like a hollow gesture, a performance for an audience that was already sharpening the knives for my back. The only thing that felt real was the girl in the laundry room, the Omega whose soul was stitched to mine with silver thread. I had watched her from the balcony earlier, seeing the way she moved with a quiet, resilient grace that made my chest ache with an unfamiliar pride. She wasn't cowering anymore. She was standing tall, her eyes reflecting a fire that I had helped ignite. My wolf was restless, a caged beast that wanted to tear down the pillars of this house and carry her away to the deep woods where the laws of men didn't reach. But I was an alpha, and an alpha does not run from the mess he inherited. I reached for a heavy leather-bound ledger, my fingers tracing the names of the families who had been erased under my father's watch, and felt the bile rise in my throat. "You're looking for ghosts, Kael," a cold voice said from the doorway, and I didn't need to look up to know it was Elder Thorn. "I'm looking for the truth, Thorn," I replied, my voice a flat, dangerous monotone that I used to mask the riot in my blood. "I'm looking for why the records of the 2018 purge are missing the signatures of the witness wolves." Thorn stepped into the room, his black cloak swishing against the floor like the wings of a scavenger bird. He didn't look afraid. He looked bored, as if my rebellion were a tedious chore he had to manage before dinner. "The truth is a luxury that strong packs cannot afford. Your father understood that loyalty is built on shared secrets, not on the fragile whims of a girl who carries the blood of a traitor." I stood up, the chair screeching against the floorboards, as the bond flared with a sudden, sharp alarm. Zara was in the courtyard, and she was in danger. I didn't wait for Thorn to finish his sentence. I vaulted over the desk and sprinted toward the door, my senses narrowing until the only thing I could perceive was her heartbeat. It was a frantic staccato rhythm that signaled terror, and it ignited a fuse in my soul that I had been trying to keep cold for weeks. I burst through the double doors of the manor just in time to see a rogue reaching for her, his filthy hands inches from the woman the moon goddess had promised me. The world turned red as I hit him, the impact a satisfying crunch of bone and sinew that sent a jolt of primal joy through my limbs. I had him by the throat, the scent of his fear acting as a catalyst for my transformation, my claws extending until they drew beads of dark blood from his neck. I wanted to end him, to make an example of anyone who dared to look at her with anything less than reverence. But through the red haze I felt a soft, cooling touch on my mind, a gentle pull from Zara that urged me to stop before I lost myself to the beast. I looked at her, standing just a few feet away with her eyes wide and her hand pressed to her heart, and the fury drained out of me as quickly as it had arrived. She wasn't looking at me with horror. She was looking at me with a profound, soul-deep understanding that broke my heart. I let the rogue fall to the ground, his body a crumpled heap of bruised meat, and turned to face the crowd of warriors who had gathered to watch the spectacle. They were silent, their expressions a mixture of awe and suspicion, as they realized their alpha was no longer a predictable weapon of the state. "Get him out of my sight," I commanded, my voice carrying to every corner of the courtyard as I stepped toward Zara. I reached out, my hand trembling as I tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, the contact sending a wave of peace through the bond that made the ground feel solid again. We stood there in the center of the packlands, a target and a protector, while the shadows of the council watched from the high windows. I knew then that the peace we had found was a fragile thing, a glass ornament in a storm of iron. Have you ever known that the best moment of your life was also the beginning of the end? I took her hand, our fingers interlaced like the roots of an ancient oak, and led her toward the sanctuary of the house, knowing that tomorrow, the war would truly begin.
Chapter 9. The Fire and the Vow. The first real argument we had wasn't about the pack or the past. It was about the way he tried to hide his scars from me. We were in the library again, the room bathed in the amber glow of a dozen flickering candles, while the wind howled through the eaves like a pack of starving wolves. Kael was pacing the length of the room, his shirt discarded on a nearby chair, revealing the jagged network of silver burns and claw marks that told the story of his reign. He looked like a man who had been carved out of stone and then broken, a masterpiece of pain that he refused to let me touch. Because the bond allowed me to feel the throbbing ache of his old wounds, I couldn't stand the distance he was trying to maintain between us. "Stop pacing, Kael," I said, my voice cutting through the silence of the room like a bell. "You're bleeding into the bond, and it's making my own skin crawl." He stopped and turned to me, his chest heaving as he fought to regain his composure, his eyes a swirling vortex of gold and shadow. "I'm fine, Zara. I just need to figure out how to move the Southern Guard without alerting Thorne's spies. I don't have time to be a patient." I walked over to him, my movements slow and deliberate, and reached out to touch the long, jagged scar that ran from his shoulder to his hip. He flinched, a low growl rumbling in his chest, but he didn't pull away as my fingers traced the raised tissue. It was cold to the touch, a reminder of a battle he had fought long before I became his mate, a wound that had never truly healed. I could feel the memories associated with the scar, the sound of breaking glass, the smell of wood smoke, and the overwhelming weight of a responsibility he hadn't asked for. "You don't have to carry it all alone," I whispered, my eyes meeting his as I leaned into his space, the heat of his body wrapping around me like a shield. "That's the point of this, isn't it? The bond isn't just for the easy parts, Kael. It's for the scars, too." His expression softened, the hard lines of his face melting into a vulnerability that made my heart ache with a fierce, protective love. He reached out and cupped my face, his thumb stroking my cheekbone with a tenderness that made me forget we were standing in the middle of a war zone. For a moment, the council didn't exist, the pack didn't exist, and there was only the two of us and the impossible connection that had turned our lives upside down. I leaned into his touch, my eyes closing as I breathed in the scent of cedar and storm clouds that had become my favorite thing in the world. "I'm afraid, Zara," he admitted, the words barely more than a breath against my skin. "I'm afraid that if I choose you, I'll lose the only world I've ever known, and if I choose the pack, I'll lose my soul." "Then don't choose either," I replied, opening my eyes and looking at him with a conviction that surprised even me. "Build a new one. A world where an Alpha can love an Omega without it being a crime. A world where the truth doesn't have to be a secret." He looked at me as if I were a miracle he didn't deserve, his grip on my face tightening slightly as he pulled me closer. We were standing on the edge of a cliff, and the wind was starting to pick up, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the fall. I realized then that my father's legacy wasn't just a story of betrayal. It was a map to a future that Kael and I were meant to create together. The bond flared with a sudden, blinding intensity, a vow that we would fight for each other until the moon fell from the sky and the earth turned to ash. But as we stood there in the quiet of the library, the heavy oak doors suddenly burst open, and Silas stumbled into the room, his face pale and his clothes torn. He looked from Kael to me, his eyes wide with a terror that made the air in the room turn to ice. The council hadn't waited for the morning. They had moved while we were distracted by our own hearts. The execution order hadn't been for a rogue wolf or a border spy. It had been for the Omega who had dared to claim the Alpha's soul. "They're coming, Kael," Silas wheezed, his hand gripping the doorframe for support. "They're coming for her, and they brought the Silver Guards." I looked at Kael, seeing the transformation take hold of him as he realized the sanctuary had been breached, his wolf rising to the surface with a fury that would burn the world down to save me. The fire was no longer just in the fireplace, it was in his eyes, and it was in the bond that linked us. We weren't just mates anymore. We were a revolution, and the war for our lives had finally reached our doorstep. Chapter 10. The Crucible of the Night. The library was no longer a sanctuary of ancient dust and leather. It had become the epicenter of an approaching storm that tasted of ozone and cold, sharpened silver. Because Silas's warning hung in the air like a death knell, my heartbeat accelerated until it was the only sound in the cavernous room, a frantic, rhythmic drumming against my ribs. I looked at Kael, watching the shadow of the Alpha shift and expand as his humanity receded, replaced by a primal, protective fury that made the very floorboards vibrate. The bond didn't just thrum anymore, it shrieked, a high-tension wire vibrating with the collective fear of a pack divided against itself. I felt the arrival of the Silver Guards before I heard them, a cold, metallic void in the psychic landscape that signaled the approach of men who had traded their souls for the Council's favor. "Get her to the tunnels, Silas," Kael commanded, his voice no longer human but a tectonic grind that seemed to come from the earth itself. "I'm not leaving you to face them alone," I countered, my voice cracking but my feet remaining rooted to the spot, even as the scent of burning torches began to seep under the heavy oak doors. He turned to me then, his eyes two burning suns of molten gold that searched mine for a flicker of the girl who used to hide in the shadows of the tavern. He saw the fire I had stolen from him, a spark of defiance that refused to be extinguished by the weight of an execution order. Because we were linked by more than just fate, he felt my resolve, a stubborn, jagged thing that mirrored his own. And for a heartbeat, the terrifying Alpha softened into the man who had held my face in the moonlight. He stepped toward me, his hand cupping the back of my neck with a grip that was both a promise and a goodbye, his thumb grazing the pulse that hammered in my throat. "This isn't a sacrifice, Zara," he whispered, his forehead dropping against mine as the first heavy blow struck the library doors, making the wood groan in protest. "This is a diversion. If they take me, the pack will hesitate. But if they take you, the revolution dies before it can draw its first breath." I wanted to scream that I didn't care about revolutions if it meant standing on his grave. But the bond broadcasted a sudden sharp image of the future. A vision of a world where Omegas weren't hunted and Alphas weren't puppets. It was a beautiful, impossible dream, and it was currently balanced on the edge of a silver blade. I reached up and gripped his forearms, the muscle beneath his skin feeling like coiled iron, and I realized that loving a king meant learning how to survive his wars. The doors shuddered again, a splintering crack echoing through the room, and I knew our seconds were numbered like falling grains of sand. "Don't you dare die," I hissed, the words a vow and a threat wrapped into one, before I let Silas pull me toward the hidden passage behind the cartography shelves. The tunnel was a damp, narrow throat of stone that smelled of wet earth and centuries of secrets, swallowing us whole as the library doors finally gave way. I heard the roar of Kael's wolf, a sound so powerful it made the dust fall from the tunnel ceiling, followed by the clatter of steel and the snarls of men who had forgotten how to be brothers. Every step I took away from him felt like a physical tearing of my spirit, the silver cord stretching until it was a thin, agonizing wire that throbbed with the echoes of his pain. Silas hurried me along, his breathing shallow and ragged, his hand a firm anchor on my arm as we navigated the darkness that had become our only ally. "Why are they doing this now?" I asked, my voice echoing hollowly off the damp walls as we descended deeper into the bowels of the estate. "Because," Silas grunted, his pace never faltering. "Kyle started asking about the blood debt ledgers, and the council realized they couldn't control a mate who was also an investigator. You aren't just his weakness, Zara. You're the key to the vault they've been guarding for 50 years. We emerged into a small, torch-lit cavern that served as a junction for the estate's drainage system, the air here thick with the smell of stagnant water and old copper. I stopped, my hand flying to my chest as a sudden sharp jolt of agony lanced through the bond, making my knees buckle. Kyle had been hit, a silver-laced strike that burned through our connection like acid, leaving a scorched trail of sensation in its wake. I leaned against the cold stone wall, gasping for air as I felt his strength begin to waver, his wolf retreating under the onslaught of the Silver Guard's specialized weaponry. "He's falling," I gasped, the terror finally breaking through my armor as I turned back toward the way we had come. "No," Silas said, his eyes reflecting the flickering torchlight with a grim, ancient clarity. "He's holding. But we have to move, Zara. The council doesn't just want you dead. They want you erased, because as long as you breathe, the lie of the Blood Moon Pack is in danger of being exposed."
Chapter 11. The Blood on the Marble. The silver burned like liquid starlight in my veins, a cold, agonizing poison that turned my blood to slush and my vision to a blurred smear of gray. I stood in the wreckage of the library, my back against a shattered mahogany desk, as 4 silver guards circled me with the practiced precision of vultures. They were my own men, warriors I had trained, men whose families I had protected, and yet they looked at me with the vacant, glassy eyes of puppets. Because the council used silver dust in the initiation rites, these guards were more machine than wolf, their loyalty enforced by a chemical leash that I had never bothered to question until it was wrapped around my own throat. "Surrender, Alpha," the lead guard droned, his voice stripped of emotion and character. "The girl is already lost. Do not throw your life away for a shadow." I spat a mouthful of metallic-tasting blood onto the white marble floor, the contrast a vivid reminder of the purity this pack claimed to uphold, and the filth it actually practiced. My wolf was a caged lightning storm, snarling at the silver shackles of the poison, fighting to keep my heart beating against the cold. I felt Zara moving through the tunnels, her presence a fading warmth at the edge of my consciousness, and I used that heat to fuel the last of my reserves. I wasn't fighting for a crown anymore. I was fighting for the right to exist in a world that she had made me believe was possible. "You'll have to take my head first," I growled, my voice a wet, ragged sound that made the guards hesitate for a fraction of a second. I lunged, my claws finding purchase in the gaps of their silver mesh armor, the impact sending a jolt of renewed agony through my system as the metal seared my flesh. We became a tangle of fur and steel, a violent dance of shadows cast against the burning tapestries of the room. I took a blade to the shoulder to land a crushing blow to the chest of the nearest guard, the sound of his ribs snapping a grim percussion to the chaos. Every movement was a struggle against the lethargy creeping into my limbs, the silver dust in the air making every breath a battle. Through the haze of the fight, I saw Elder Thorn standing in the doorway, his silhouette a dark blot against the flickering orange light of the hallway. He wasn't armed, but he carried the weight of the old laws like a physical weapon, his presence a constant pressure that demanded submission. He watched me struggle with a detached curiosity, as if I were a laboratory specimen that had exceeded its expected lifespan. Because he had been the one to mentor me after my father's death, seeing him now was like watching the mask of my childhood fall away to reveal a monster.
"Such a waste of potential," Thorn sighed, his voice carrying over the din of the struggle. "You could have been the greatest alpha this pack has ever seen, Kael, but you allowed a low-born girl to distract you with fairy tales of justice." Justice isn't a fairy tale, I wheezed, pinning a guard to the wall even as a second blade found its way into my side. It's the only thing that keeps us from being animals. I felt the bond stretch and snap tight, a sudden surge of strength flooding my system that didn't belong to me. It was Zara. She was reaching back through the darkness, her will acting as a splint for my broken resolve. She wasn't cowering in a tunnel. She was fighting her own battle with fear, and she was sending me the spoils of her victory. I let out a roar that shattered the remaining glass in the windows, my wolf surging forward with a desperate final intensity that sent the remaining guards flying back like autumn leaves in a gale. I stood alone in the center of the ruins, my breathing a series of ragged, wet gasps as I stared at Thorn. The poison was winning, my legs feeling like they were made of lead, but I refused to fall while he was still standing. I saw the flash of something in his hand, a small, ornate vial that looked like it belonged in a museum rather than a battlefield. He didn't throw it, he simply uncorked it, and a thick purple mist began to spill out, coiling around his feet like a living thing. "The girl will be caught, Kael," Thorn said, his voice fading as the mist began to fill the room, stinging my eyes and dulling my senses. "And when she is, you will be the one to sign her death warrant. It's the only way to prove your loyalty to the Blood Moon." I tried to reach for him, but the floor rose up to meet me, the marble cold against my fevered skin. As the darkness pulled at my consciousness, I sent one last message through the bond, a single burning image of the sunrise we had watched together. "Run, Zara," I thought, the words a silent plea that echoed into the void. "Run until the world turns gold." Chapter 12. The Truth in the Deep. The tunnel opened into a vast subterranean cathedral of limestone and dripping water, a place the pack called the Root Vault. It was here that the original founders had signed the treaties that formed the Blood Moon, and it was here that the true history of our people was etched into the very stones. I stood in the center of the chamber, my torch casting long, dancing shadows against the walls, while Silas worked to bar the heavy iron gate behind us. Because the bond had gone silent, a terrifying hollow void where Kael's heartbeat used to be, I felt like a ghost wandering through a graveyard of my own hopes. "He's gone," I whispered, the words tasting like ash in my mouth as I slumped against a moss-covered pillar. "He's not gone," Silas snapped, though his hands were shaking as he adjusted the heavy bolt. "He's suppressed. The council uses a specialized salt to dampen the bond during executions. It doesn't mean he's dead, it means they're trying to make you feel alone so you'll stop fighting." I looked at the walls around me, noticing for the first time that they weren't just natural formations. They were covered in thousands of tiny, etched names, a census of the dead that stretched back centuries. I walked toward the nearest wall, my fingers brushing against the cold stone, and felt a sudden, sharp jolt of recognition. There, carved into a section of the wall that looked newer than the rest, was my father's name. And beneath it, a list of dates that didn't match the official story of his exile. "Silas. Look at this," I said, my voice trembling as I held the torch closer to the inscriptions. "It says he died 3 days before the fire at our house. If he was already dead, then who was the man the pack saw running from the armory?" Silas joined me, his eyes widening as he read the carved record, his breath hitching in his chest. "This is the Blood Chronicle. It's written by the Pack's Oracle, a wolf who cannot lie because their magic is tied to the earth. If this says he died on the 12th, then the man in the fire was a shapeshifter, a glamour." The realization hit me with the force of a tidal wave, drowning out the fear and leaving only a cold, crystalline rage. My father hadn't been a traitor. He had been a victim of a high-level conspiracy to protect a secret so dangerous the council was willing to murder an entire lineage to keep it. Because I was the last of that lineage, I wasn't just a mate to the Alpha. I was the living evidence of the council's greatest crime. I turned away from the wall, my gaze falling on a heavy stone chest at the base of the pillar, its lid sealed with the wax of the Alpha's signet. "That's the Sovereign's cache," Silas whispered, his voice full of a sudden, fearful reverence. "Only the Alpha or his mate can open it. It's where the original treaties are kept, the ones that define the laws of the blood moon. I didn't hesitate. I pressed my palm against the cold wax, feeling a sharp prick of pain as a needle-thin barb drew a drop of my blood. The blood of the fallen, the blood of the rejected. The seal glowed with a faint blue light before shattering into 1,000 pieces, the heavy lid sliding open with a groan that sounded like a sigh of relief. Inside lay a single yellowed scroll and a small silver locket that I recognized instantly. It was the one from my father's memory, the one the sun had caught just before the fire started. I opened the locket, expecting to see a picture of my mother, but instead, I found a tiny, folded piece of parchment covered in my father's cramped, elegant handwriting. It was a list of names, the members of the council who had accepted silver bribes from the human hunters to allow culling on our borders. The Blood Moon Pack wasn't just being ruled by tyrants. It was being sold to the very enemies we were sworn to fight. "They aren't protecting the pack," I said, my voice growing stronger with every word as I held the list out to Silas. "They're selling us by the pound, and Kael is the only thing standing in their way." A sudden, booming explosion rocked the cavern, sending a shower of dust and small stones from the ceiling. The iron gate groaned as if hit by a battering ram, and the silence of the deep was replaced by the rhythmic chanting of the Silver Guard. They had found us. I looked at the scroll in my hand, then at the locket, and I knew what I had to do. I wasn't an Omega hiding in a tavern anymore. I was the daughter of the man who had died to save his pack, and I was the mate of the man who was currently dying to protect me. "We have to get back to the surface," I said, my eyes meeting Silas's with a fierce, unwavering light. "We don't just have the truth, Silas. We have the proof. And I'm going to make sure every wolf in the blood moon sees it before the sun goes down." The gate shivered under another blow, and the first wisps of purple mist began to curl through the gaps. I tucked the locket into my tunic and grabbed the torch, the fire reflecting in my eyes like a promise of the conflagration to come. The council thought they could erase me, but they forgot one thing. A shadow only exists because of the light, and I was about to set the entire world on fire. Chapter 13. The Alpha's Decree. The climb from the root vault felt like ascending through the gullet of a dying beast, the air growing thick with the acrid stench of burning cedar and the heavy electric charge of a pack on the brink of civil war. Because the purple mist had begun to seep into the lower tunnels, my lungs burned with every breath, each gasp a reminder that the council's reach extended even into the sacred foundations of our history. Silas moved ahead of me, his silhouette a jagged shadow against the flickering torchlight as he used a heavy iron pry bar to wedge open the secret grate leading into the Alpha's private courtyard. I clutched the silver locket against my chest, the metal biting into my palm, a grounding pain that kept the encroaching void of the suppressed bond from swallowing my sanity. Since the moment the connection to Kael had been severed by the council's salt magic, I had felt like a kite with its string cut, drifting aimlessly in a storm of someone else's making. The silence in my head was a physical weight, a hollow echoing chamber where his heartbeat used to provide a steady, reassuring rhythm. I pushed through the narrow opening, my tunic tearing on the jagged stone, and emerged into a night that had been transformed into a landscape of fire and flickering steel. The courtyard was swarming with warriors, their eyes reflecting the orange glow of the burning library wing, their voices a discordant symphony of confusion and bloodlust. "He's on the dais," Silas hissed, pulling me behind a stone pillar as a patrol of silver guards marched past, their armor gleaming with a cold, predatory light. I looked toward the center of the packlands, where the ancient stone platform stood beneath the shadow of the great oak, and my heart stopped. Kael was there, but he wasn't the defiant king I had left in the library. He was a broken god, chained to the execution posts with heavy silver shackles that hissed against his skin. His head was bowed, his dark hair matted with blood, while Elder Thorn stood over him like a triumphant vulture. Because the pack laws demanded a public trial for an Alpha's madness, the entire blood moon had gathered to witness the fall of the man who had dared to love a ghost. Citizens of the blood moon, Thorn's voice boomed, amplified by the natural acoustics of the stone semicircle. Your Alpha has traded your safety for the charms of a traitor's daughter. He has looked into forbidden records and questioned the very foundations of our peace. I saw Kael flinch, his muscles bunching as he tried to pull against the silver, the sound of the chains a rhythmic clanking that made my own blood turn to ice. He was fighting for us, even now, enduring an agony I couldn't even imagine to buy me a few more minutes of life. I looked at the locket in my hand and then at the faces of the warriors, men and women who had been told that their poverty and their struggles were the result of external enemies, not internal rot. They weren't monsters. They were victims of a lie that was older than I was, and I was the only one who could pull back the curtain. I have to get up there, I whispered to Silas, my eyes searching for a path through the sea of fur and muscle. It's suicide, Zara, he replied, though his hand was already reaching for the hilt of his blade. The second you step into the light, the silver guard will cut you down. Then let them, I said, my voice rising with a sudden crystalline clarity that silenced the buzzing in my ears. Because as long as I'm in the shadows, the lie wins. I'm not a victim anymore, Silas. I'm the evidence. I didn't wait for his approval. I stepped out from behind the pillar, the light of the fires catching the white fabric of my torn shift, making me look like a vengeful spirit summoned from the ash. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. The sight of an Omega walking toward the execution dais was so outside the realm of possibility that the warriors simply froze. I walked with my head held high, my gaze locked on the man in chains, sending every ounce of my will through the silent bond. I'm here, Kael, I thought, the words a burning flare in the darkness of our connection. Look at me.
Chapter 14. The Shadow of the Blade. The world was a blur of gray agony and the metallic taste of my own failure, the silver poison in my veins turning every breath into a serrated edge. I hung from the chains, my weight supported only by the shackles that were eating through the skin of my wrists, while Thorn's voice droned on like the buzzing of a fly over a corpse. Because the salt magic had muted my wolf, I felt small, a mortal man stripped of his fangs and his fury, waiting for the final blow to fall. I had failed her. I had sent Zara into the tunnels only for the council to turn the entire pack into her executioners. Sign the warrant, Kael, Thorn whispered, leaning close so only I could hear the cold satisfaction in his tone. Sign it, and we will let you live as a puppet. Refuse, and we will burn the Omega before your eyes, before we take your head. I looked up, my vision swimming, and for a moment, I thought the poison was finally inducing the hallucinations the healers warned about. There, at the edge of the torchlight, was a figure in white, walking through the crowd of warriors like a goddess of the moon. It was Zara. She wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. She was marching toward the dais with a fury that made the most seasoned warriors step back in confusion. My heart hammered against my ribs, a sudden, violent surge of adrenaline fighting against the silver lethargy, as I realized she was carrying something in her hand. Stop! Her voice rang out, a sharp, commanding sound that cut through Thorn's rhetoric like a blade through silk. Thorn turned, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage as he saw his prize walking straight into his trap. He signaled to the silver guard, their weapons leveling with lethal precision, but the pack was no longer listening to his commands. They were looking at Zara, at the way she didn't flinch, at the way she held herself with the authority of a queen who had found her throne. She reached the base of the dais and held up a silver locket, the metal catching the firelight and throwing jagged reflections across the stone. The council tells you that my father was a traitor, she shouted, her voice amplified by the silence of the crowd. They tell you that the Alpha has gone mad. But here is the truth they buried in the root vault. Here is the list of the men who sold your brothers and sisters to the hunters for silver and gold. The murmur that rippled through the pack wasn't one of confusion. It was the sound of a predator realizing it had been deceived by its own kind. I felt the bond snap back into place, a sudden, blinding flash of white light as Zara's proximity shattered the salt magic. The heat returned to my blood, the silver shackles feeling like nothing more than paper as my wolf surged to the surface with a roar that shook the very foundations of the dais. I wasn't a broken king anymore. I was a mate who had found his reason to fight, and the world was about to burn for what it had done to her. "Lies!" Thorn screamed, his hand reaching for the ceremonial dagger at his waist. "She is a shapeshifter, a glamour sent to destroy us." But the pack was already moving. Silas had emerged from the shadows, the heavy ledgers from the Alpha House held high, and the warriors were beginning to close in on the council members. The Silver Guard hesitated, their chemical leash fraying as they looked from their masters to the Alpha, who was currently snapping his chains like they were made of dry straw. I stepped forward, the silver still hissing in my wounds, and stood beside Zara, my hand finding hers in the center of the storm. "You wanted a trial, Thorn," I growled, my voice a tectonic vibration that made the elders cower. "Now you have one. But the judge isn't the council. It's the pack."
Chapter 15. The Breaking of the Chains. The air in the courtyard was thick with the scent of ozone and the heavy metallic tang of shifting wolves as the transition from order to chaos happened in the blink of an eye. Because the truth had been spoken, the invisible chains of the council's authority had shattered, leaving a vacuum that was instantly filled by the raw, primal energy of a pack reclaimed. I stood beside Kael, my hand anchored in his as the Silver Guard finally turned their weapons on the elders they had been sworn to protect. Thorn tried to flee, his black cloak billowing like smoke, but he was swallowed by a sea of gray and brown fur before he could reach the safety of the manor. "It's over, Zara," Kael whispered, his voice ragged and thick with the aftermath of the poison. Yet his grip on my hand was the strongest thing I had ever felt. "No," I replied, looking at the burning library and the warriors who were finally looking at each other without fear. "It's just beginning. We have to show them that we can be more than what they made us." The night didn't end with a victory march. It ended with a quiet, somber gathering around the great oak, the firelight casting long shadows against the names of the fallen. We spent the hours before dawn untangling the web of lies the council had woven, reading the names from the locket and the ledgers until the air was filled with the ghosts of the families we had lost. Every wolf who had been told they were unworthy found a place at the table, and every warrior who had been used as a tool found a reason to be a man again. I saw Silas sitting with a group of young Omegas, his smile finally reaching his eyes as he shared the stories of the root vault. As the first streaks of gold began to bleed across the horizon, Kael led me to the edge of the veranda, the packlands laid out before us like a fresh page waiting to be written. He was still wounded, the silver scars a permanent part of his history, but he stood with a peace that I hadn't seen since the day I walked into the tavern. He turned to me, the morning light catching the gold in his eyes, and I realized that we had done the impossible. We had taken the rejection and the erasure and turned them into a foundation for something new. "They'll still look to me for leadership," he said, his hand trailing over the stone railing. "But I don't want to lead them alone, Zara. I want the woman who rewrote fate to stand beside me." "I'm not a queen, Kael," I said, leaning my head against his shoulder as the warmth of the sun finally touched my skin. "I'm just a girl who decided she wasn't going to be a ghost anymore." "To them, you're a revolution," he countered, pulling me into the circle of his arms until I could feel his heartbeat mimicking mine. "And to me, you're the only thing that matters in a world that finally makes sense." I looked out at the sunrise, feeling the bond hum with a steady, joyous vibration that signaled the end of the long night. We had been rejected, erased, and taught that we were unworthy of love. But in the end, we had chosen each other. And as the pack began to wake to a world without shadows, I knew that the story of the silver moon wouldn't be one of tragedy, but of triumph. The chains were gone, the fire was out, and for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was meant to be. Chapter 16. The Fracture of the Soul. Since the dawn of the new council, the air in the Blood Moon territory had tasted of a tentative, fragile peace, But beneath the surface, the ghosts of the old regime still clawed at the foundations of our home. I stood in the center of the reconstructed Great Hall, the smell of fresh cedar and lemon oil masking the lingering scent of charred history that seemed to seep from the very stones. Because I had spent my entire life being the girl in the shadows, sitting in a high-backed chair at Kael's right hand felt like wearing a suit of heavy, ill-fitting armor. My fingers traced the intricate carvings on the armrest, ancient wolves frozen in a perpetual hunt, while my eyes scanned the faces of the pack members who were now looking at me for guidance instead of looking through me for a target. The bond with Kael was a steady, rhythmic thrum in the back of my mind, but today, that rhythm was jagged, spiked with a cold anxiety that I couldn't quite name. "The border packs are restless, Zara," Kael's voice broke through my reverie, a low vibration that usually calmed my nerves, but now only served to tighten the knot in my stomach. I turned to him, noticing the way the sunlight caught the silver scars on his jaw, a permanent map of the price we had paid for this throne. He looked tired, a deep, marrow-deep exhaustion that no amount of sleep could cure, and his scent was laced with the metallic tang of stress. Because we were linked by more than just duty, I felt the exact moment his composure fractured, a sudden wave of guilt washing over our connection that made my own breath hitch. He wasn't just worried about the borders, he was drowning in the secrets he was still keeping from me, secrets that sat like lead in the center of his chest. "They aren't just restless because of the change in leadership, are they?" I asked, my voice echoing in the vast, quiet hall as the servants scurried away to avoid the impending storm. "They've heard rumors about the root vault records," he replied, his gaze dropping to the floor as if the marble held the answers he was too afraid to give. "They're questioning why my father's signature is on the very orders that led to your family's to the fire." The air in the room seemed to vanish, replaced by a suffocating pressure that made my skin prickle with an old, familiar terror. I had known his father was involved, but hearing it spoken aloud in the seat of our shared power was a physical blow that sent a tremor through my hands. Have you ever felt the ground crumble beneath you just as you thought you had finally found your footing? I stood up, the chair scraping harshly against the stone, and walked toward the window to avoid the crushing weight of his stare. The forest outside looked dark and forbidding, a sea of emerald shadows that seemed to be closing in on the manor. "You knew," I whispered, the words tasting like copper on my tongue as the bond flared with a sudden agonizing flash of his shame. "You knew he didn't just follow orders, he wrote them." "I found the original drafts last night," Kael said, his voice cracking as he stepped toward me, his hand reaching out only to fall back to his side. "I wanted to protect you from it, Zara. I thought if I could just bury the past, we could build something that wasn't poisoned by his blood." Because his protection felt like another cage, I turned on him, my eyes burning with a rage that was fueled by a decade of silence. We were standing in the heart of our revolution, but the rot was still there, hidden beneath the fresh paint and the new laws. The bond shrieked with the intensity of our conflict, a high-tension wire that threatened to snap and take both of our souls with it. I realized then that love isn't a shield against the truth. It's the very thing that makes the truth so much harder to bear.
Chapter 17. The Betrayal of Blood. The scent of her disappointment was a jagged blade that cut through my defenses, leaving me raw and exposed in a room that was supposed to be our sanctuary. I watched Zara stand by the window, her silhouette a fragile line against the vast, unforgiving forest, and I felt the weight of my father's crown crushing the life out of my lungs. Because I had tried to play God with her grief, I had become the very thing I swore to destroy, a man who used silence as a weapon to maintain a comfortable lie. My wolf was snarling at the back of my mind, a trapped beast that wanted to howl at the moon and tear the world apart to make her look at me without that hollow, haunted expression. "I didn't do it to control you," I groaned, the words feeling inadequate and small in the face of her towering silence. "I did it because I couldn't stand the thought of you looking at me and seeing him." "But you are him, Kael," she said, turning to face me with a cold, crystalline clarity that made my blood run cold. "Every time you hide the truth to protect the pack, You are wearing his mask. Every time you decide what I can and cannot handle, you are using his voice. The accusation hit me with the force of a physical blow, making me stagger back against the heavy mahogany table. She was right. I had been so focused on being a better leader than my father that I had forgotten how to be a partner to the woman who had saved my soul. The bond was a chaotic storm of grief and resentment, a dark mirror that reflected the ugliness I had tried to keep in the shadows. I reached for the leather-bound ledger I had hidden in the desk, the one that contained the final damning evidence of my father's hand in the massacre of her kin. "Then look at it," I challenged, my voice dropping to a dangerous vibrating hush as I slid the book across the marble toward her. "Look at the ink and the seals. Look at the man who gave me life and then used that life to destroy yours." I watched her hands tremble as she opened the cover, her eyes scanning the pages with a hunger for justice that I knew would end in heartbreak. The room was silent except for the frantic ticking of the clock on the mantel and the ragged sound of our shared breathing. Because I couldn't bear to see the moment her heart finally broke for good, I looked away, my gaze fixing on the portrait of my father that still hung in the shadows of the library. He looked so noble in the oil painting, a lie captured in brushstrokes, while the truth was bleeding out on the table before me. "He didn't just kill them for the hunters," Zara whispered, her voice a ghost of a sound that made the hair on my neck stand up. "He killed them because my mother, she was his fated mate before she chose my father." The revelation was a tectonic shift that threatened to level the entire estate, a secret so ancient and twisted that it turned my history into a horror story. My father hadn't been a patriot or a businessman. He had been a jilted lover who had used the power of the Alpha to exact a petty, murderous revenge. I felt a surge of nausea so strong I had to grip the edge of the table to keep from falling. We weren't just the children of enemies. We were the survivors of a tragedy that had been written in the stars and then rewritten in blood. "He tried to steal her," I gasped, the pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place with a sickening finality. "And when he couldn't have her, he made sure nobody else could either." I looked at Zara, seeing the way her eyes were now fixed on me with a new kind of horror, a realization that the bond between us was echoes of a connection that had already ended in fire once before. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was a low, humming tension that signaled the end of the world as we knew it. Why does the past always find a way to bleed into the present, staining everything it touches? I reached out for her, but for the first time since the night of the execution, she stepped back, the distance between us a canyon that no bridge could ever cross.
Chapter 18. The Lowest Point. The night arrived with a cold, biting wind that rattled the window panes of my private quarters, a sound that mirrored the shattering of my heart into 1,000 jagged pieces. I sat on the floor in the darkness, the ledger lying open beside me like an open wound that refused to stop bleeding. Because the bond had fractured under the weight of the truth, I felt empty, a hollow vessel that had been stripped of its purpose and its light. Kyle was somewhere in the house. I could feel his agonizing guilt like a dull ache in my chest, but the bridge between our minds had been washed away by the tide of our parents' sins. I looked at the silver locket that still hung around my neck, the metal feeling like a heavy stone that was pulling me under the water. My mother had chosen love over fate, and she had paid for it with her life, her husband's life, and my childhood. Was this the destiny of every woman who dared to stand beside an alpha? To be a footnote in a story of violence and obsession? The darkness of the room seemed to press in on me, the shadows stretching out like long, black fingers trying to pull me back into the erasure I had worked so hard to escape. "I can't stay here, Kyle," I whispered to the empty air, knowing he could hear me through the static of our connection. "I can't live in a house that was built on her screams." A sudden sharp movement in the shadows made me gasp, my hand flying to the dagger I now kept at my waist. I expected to see a guard or a spy, but instead, I saw the shimmering purple mist of the council's salt magic beginning to curl under the door. They hadn't been defeated. They had simply been waiting for the moment we were most divided to strike. I tried to stand, but my limbs felt like lead, the poison acting with a speed that suggested it had been lacing our water for days. Zara! Kyle's voice echoed through the hallway, followed by the sound of a heavy struggle and the clatter of silver chains. He was being captured again, but this time, there was no crowd to witness the trial and no truth left to save us. The bond went silent with a sudden violent snap that made me scream, a void opening up in my mind where his soul used to be. I was alone. Truly, completely alone for the first time since the night of the fire. As the purple mist filled my lungs, I felt the darkness of the erasure returning, a cold, heavy blanket that promised to wipe away the pain and the memory of the man I had loved. I fell to the floor, my fingers brushing against the cold marble, and I realized that the lowest point isn't when you lose your life. It's when you lose the reason why you were living it in the first place. Kael was gone. The truth was a curse, and the shadows were finally winning. I closed my eyes, the image of his golden gaze the last thing I saw before the world turned to ash, wondering if anyone would ever remember the girl who tried to rewrite fate.
Chapter 19. The Breaking of the King. The darkness in the dungeon didn't just smell of damp stone and ancient rot. It tasted of the silver-laced water they had been forcing down my throat for hours. Because the council had spent decades perfecting the art of breaking alphas, they knew that physical pain was nothing compared to the psychic agony of a severed bond. I hung from the ceiling by heavy, magnetized shackles that pulled at my shoulders until the joints screamed, my toes barely brushing the freezing slime on the floor. My wolf was a whimpering shadow in the back of my mind, a creature beaten into submission by the constant high-frequency hum of the silver mesh walls. Every time I tried to reach for Zara through the connection, I was met with a wall of static that felt like jagged glass scraping against my brain. "She's already forgotten you, Kyle." A voice hissed from the observation slit, the sound distorted by the heavy iron door. I didn't answer, my tongue feeling like a lead weight in my mouth. But the bond suddenly spiked with a phantom sensation, the smell of lilies and old parchment. It was a lingering echo, a ghost of her presence that the salt magic couldn't quite erase, and it acted as a needle of fire in my heart. They had taken her to the execution grounds, the same stone dais where we had stood in triumph only weeks ago. But this time, the pack was being held back by a line of human mercenaries. The council had stopped pretending to be protectors. They were now the open conduits for the hunters, trading our sovereignty for a chance to wipe the slate clean. "You had the world in your hands," the voice continued, the door creaking open to reveal Elder Thorn, his face a map of smug, unrestrained malice. "You could have been the legend that united the shifting tribes. Instead, you chose a girl whose very existence is a testament to your father's failure." I looked up, my vision swimming in a sea of red and gray, and for a heartbeat, the silver lethargy retreated under a wave of pure, concentrated rage. Because he had mentioned her, the barrier in my mind cracked, allowing a single, white-hot image of Zara to flood my consciousness. She wasn't a failure. She was the only thing in my life that had ever been real, the only truth in a kingdom built on lies. I began to pull against the chains, the sound of the magnets groaning against the ceiling, a rhythmic clanking that made Thorn's smile falter. "I'm going to kill you," I wheezed, my voice a wet, tectonic grind that sent a ripple of genuine fear through the elder's eyes. "I'm going to tear the throat out of every man who touched her, and I'm going to burn your legacy until not even the ash remains." Thorn stepped back, his hand flying to the silver-tipped cane at his waist, but the air in the cell had already changed, the pressure rising until the stone walls began to sweat. I wasn't fighting for a crown anymore, and I wasn't fighting for the pack. I was fighting for the woman who had taught me that a king is only as strong as the heart he protects. The shackles hissed as my skin began to steam, the internal heat of my wolf finally overriding the silver poison in a desperate last-ditch effort to save its mate. Have you ever felt the exact moment a man stops being a leader and becomes a monster? That was the moment the magnets failed, and I hit the floor with a sound that signaled the end of the council's reign.
Chapter 20. The cold clarity of the end. The execution grounds were silent except for the whistling of the wind through the great oak, a sound that felt like the earth itself was mourning the death of the blood moon. I stood on the dais, my hands bound in front of me with silver wire that cut into my wrists every time I moved, while the mercenaries watched the tree line with bored, predatory eyes. Because the council had stripped me of my tunic and replaced it with a thin, white shroud, the cold was a physical weight that pressed against my lungs, making every breath a struggle. I looked out at the pack, seeing the faces of the people I had tried to save, men and women who were now being herded like cattle by men who didn't even know our language. "Do you have any last words, Omega?" the mercenary captain asked, his voice a flat, mechanical sound that lacked even the dignity of hatred. "I already said them," I replied, my voice carrying across the silent clearing with a strength that surprised even me. "The truth doesn't need to be repeated to be real. You can kill the messenger, but you can't kill the message." The captain laughed, a short, barking sound that made the hair on my neck stand up, and he raised a heavy, silver-plated crossbow to his shoulder. I closed my eyes, expecting the sting of the bolt, but instead, I felt a sudden, violent shift in the atmosphere, a drop in pressure that made my ears pop. The bond, which had been a silent void for hours, suddenly roared back to life with the intensity of 1,000 suns, a tidal wave of Kael's fury crashing into my mind. He was close. He was coming. And he was bringing the apocalypse with him. "Look at me!" A roar echoed from the edge of the clearing, a sound so powerful it made the heavy stones of the dais vibrate beneath my feet. Kael burst from the tree line, his form a blur of gray fur and blood-stained muscle, moving with a speed that defied the laws of biology. He wasn't a man, and he wasn't just a wolf. He was a force of nature, a whirlwind of teeth and claws that tore through the mercenary line like it was made of dry parchment. The air was filled with the scent of ozone and copper, the screams of the dying a grim percussion to the rhythmic thud of his paws on the earth. I watched him, my heart hammering against my ribs, and I realized that he hadn't just escaped, he had evolved. Because the mercenaries were focused on the beast, they didn't notice Silas and the remaining loyalist warriors emerging from the shadows of the manor, their eyes glowing with the same fierce, unwavering light. The battle was short and brutal, a localized hurricane of violence that left the execution grounds painted in the colors of the council's defeat. Kael reached the base of the dais in a single massive leap, his eyes finding mine with a hunger that made the silver wire on my wrists feel like nothing more than cobwebs. He shifted back to his human form mid-air, landing before me with a grace that was both beautiful and terrifying. "I told you," he gasped, his chest heaving as he reached for my bindings, his touch a searing heat that made the silver hiss and snap. "I choose you. Over the pack, over the crown, over the world."
Chapter 21. The Protector's Fury. The weight of her body against mine was the only thing that kept me from descending into a permanent, feral madness as the last of the mercenaries fled into the darkness of the woods. I held Zara in the center of the ruins, my hands shaking as I checked her for wounds. My senses dialed to an impossible frequency that recorded every shallow breath she took. Because I had almost lost her to the shadows of my father's past, the protective instinct in my blood was a roaring fire that refused to be extinguished. I looked at the survivors of the pack, the warriors who had stood by and watched her execution, and I felt a surge of contempt so strong it made my vision tunnel. "They don't deserve you," I growled, my voice still carrying the gravelly vibration of the wolf. "They don't deserve the truth you gave them." "They're afraid, Kael," she whispered, her hand finding the back of my neck, her touch a cooling balm on my overheated skin. "Fear makes people do things they regret. If we walk away now, we're just as bad as the men who built this place." I looked down at her, seeing the blood on her wrists and the exhaustion in her eyes, and I realized that she was still the stronger of the two of us. She wasn't looking for revenge. She was looking for a resolution, a way to end the cycle of violence that had claimed our parents and nearly claimed us. Because she was my mate, her will was my command. A realization that made the beast in my chest settle into a low, watchful hum. I turned back to the pack, my gaze fixing on Silas, who was standing at the edge of the dais with his head bowed in a mixture of shame and relief. "The council is gone," I shouted, my voice carrying to the furthest edges of the clearing. "The hunters are gone, but the blood moon is still broken. If you want a leader who will lie to you to keep you comfortable, find another man. But if you want a future that is built on the truth, then stand with us." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of 1,000 years of tradition being discarded in a single moment. One by one, the warriors began to step forward, their heads lowering in a gesture of submission that was based on respect rather than fear. They weren't kneeling to a king. They were kneeling to the idea of a pack that could finally breathe without the scent of silver in the air. I felt the bond with Zara smooth out, a steady, rhythmic pulse of acceptance that signaled the end of the war for our souls. "We have to go to the root vault," Zara said, her eyes meeting mine with a fierce, unwavering clarity. "We have to finish what my father started. We have to burn the records, Kael. All of them." I nodded, knowing that she was right. We couldn't build a new world on the blueprints of the old one. We had to destroy the foundation before we could start again. I took her hand, our fingers interlaced like the roots of the great oak, and led her toward the dark opening of the manor, knowing that the final push wasn't a battle of claws but a battle of will. The moon was high, the air was clear, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the shadows. We were the light, and we were about to set the entire world on fire.
Chapter 22. The Altar of Ash. The descent into the root vault felt different this time, the air no longer heavy with the stagnant weight of secrets, but electric with the finality of a closing door. I walked down the spiral stone stairs, my hand resting lightly on the cold, damp wall, while the flickering torch in Kael's grip cast our joined shadows against the ancient carvings. Because the bond had settled into a profound, shimmering resonance, I didn't need to look at him to know his heart was hammering a rhythm of liberation against his ribs. We reached the central chamber, where the names of the fallen were etched into the limestone, a silent audience of ghosts waiting for us to either continue their cycle of misery or break the wheel forever. The smell of old parchment and damp earth was being slowly overtaken by the scent of the cedar oil Silas had helped us carry down, a funeral shroud for the lies that had defined our lives. "It feels like we're committing a crime," Kael whispered, his voice echoing in the vast, hollow space as he looked at the sovereign's cache, where the original tainted treaties lay. "We are," I replied, stepping toward the center of the vault where the blood chronicle was carved. "We're murdering a version of history that was written in our parents' blood. It's a mercy killing, Kael." I watched him hesitate, his fingers grazing the leather spines of the council's ledgers, the books that detailed every silver bribe, every framed execution, and every stolen mate. Because he was the son of the man who had penned these horrors, he felt the weight of the legacy trying to pull him back into the role of the dutiful Alpha. I reached out, my fingers interlaced with his, the heat of our shared mark acting as a grounding wire for the storm of his doubt. He looked at me, the gold in his eyes reflecting the dancing torchlight, and I saw the exact moment he let go of the ghost of his father. He didn't just want to be a better man, he wanted to be a new kind of creature entirely, one that didn't need the validation of a broken lineage to feel whole. "Do it," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble that vibrated through the soles of my feet. I took the torch from his hand and lowered it to the oil-soaked pile of documents we had gathered in the center of the chamber. The flame caught instantly, a hungry orange tongue licking at the yellowed paper, devouring the signatures of tyrants and the records of our erasure. Because the vault had no ventilation, the smoke began to curl toward the ceiling, obscuring the names on the walls until the past was nothing but a gray, shifting haze. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of grief for the girl I used to be, the one who hid in the tavern, but it was quickly replaced by a soaring sense of space. Have you ever felt the lightness that comes when you finally stop carrying a mountain on your back? That was the moment the root vault turned into an oven of truth.
Chapter 23. The king uncrowned. The heat of the conflagration in the vault was a physical purge, a wall of fire that seemed to cauterize the silver scars on my soul as I watched the ledgers turn to black flakes. I stood beside Zara, my arm wrapped around her waist to keep her steady as the air in the chamber grew thin and the shadows of the ancestors danced in the flickering light. Because the pack was waiting for us on the surface, I knew that walking out of this smoke would be the hardest thing I had ever done. It meant admitting that I had no divine right to lead them. My wolf was quiet, a calm, watchful presence that seemed to approve of the destruction, recognizing that a pack built on a lie is just a cage with different names for the bars. I looked at the girl who had started this fire, seeing the soot on her cheek and the fierce, unyielding light in her eyes, and I realized I would follow her into the abyss if she asked. "They're going to expect a speech, Kael," she said, her voice muffled by the thick, sweet scent of burning cedar. "They're going to get the truth," I replied, pulling her closer until her heartbeat was the only thing I could hear over the roar of the flames. "I'm going to tell them that the Alpha is a title, not a god, and I'm going to tell them that I belong to you before I belong to any of them." We turned away from the fire and began the climb back toward the surface, our lungs burning but our spirits lighter than they had been in a decade. We emerged from the secret grate into a morning that was so bright it felt like a physical blow, the sun cresting the horizon in a riot of gold and violet. The entire Blood Moon pack was gathered in the courtyard, warriors, elders, omegas, and children, all standing in a silence so profound it felt like the world was holding its breath. Because I was still wearing the tattered remains of my execution clothes, I looked like a ghost returning from the grave. But as I stepped onto the veranda, I felt the shift in their energy. They weren't waiting for a command. They were waiting for a confession. I didn't take my place on the high dais. Instead, I stepped down onto the grass, level with the people I had been raised to rule. I felt Zara beside me, her hand a warm anchor in the center of my palm, and I saw Silas nodding from the front row with a look of exhausted pride. I didn't use the Alpha's roar to silence them. I simply spoke, my voice carrying on the morning breeze with a clarity that didn't need amplification. I told them about the root vault, about the bribes, and about the way our history had been a weapon used against us. I saw the shock on their faces turn to anger, and then, slowly, into a quiet, somber understanding. "I am not your king because my father was a murderer," I said, my gaze sweeping over the warriors who had once hunted Zara in the streets. "I am your brother because we all survived the same lie. If you want me to lead, it will be because you choose it, and because she stands beside me as your equal." I looked at Zara and did something that no Alpha in the history of the Silver Moon had ever done. I knelt. I didn't kneel to a council or a god. I knelt to the woman who had saved the pack by refusing to be erased by it. Because I was the man meant to destroy her, my submission was the final seal on the new world we were building. The silence held for a heartbeat, two, and then it broke. Not with a roar of war, but with the sound of 1,000 wolves sitting, a collective gesture of respect that rippled through the courtyard like a wave. They weren't kneeling to me. They were acknowledging the truth she carried.
Chapter 24. The New Dawn. The sun was high over the Silver Moon Tavern, but the air inside was no longer thick with the scent of fear and stale ale. It was filled with the sound of laughter and the clinking of glasses for a celebration that had been 10 years in the making. I stood behind the bar, not as a servant, but as a host, watching Silas teach a group of young pups how to track the scent of wild jasmine instead of blood. Because we had rewritten the laws, the hierarchy that had nearly killed us was a fading memory, replaced by a system where a wolf's worth was measured by their heart rather than their pedigree. Kael was sitting at a central table, his large hand wrapped around a mug of cider, looking like a man who had finally found a way to be at peace with his own shadow. He wasn't the brooding tyrant of my nightmares anymore. He was the partner who had helped me turn my scars into armor. "You look like you're plotting another revolution," he teased, standing up and weaving through the crowd to reach me, his eyes glowing with that familiar molten gold. "I'm just thinking about how much work we have left to do," I replied, leaning over the scarred mahogany to steal a kiss that tasted of freedom and home. The border packs are still asking for the new trade agreements, and Silas wants to start the school in the old council chambers. Tomorrow, Kyle whispered, his hand finding the back of my neck, his touch a constant, beautiful reminder of the bond that had saved us both. Today is for the girl who survived the fire. Today is for the woman who chose love when the world told her she wasn't worthy of it. I looked around the room, seeing the faces of the people who had once been my oppressors and were now my family, and I realized that the core emotional question of my life had finally been answered. Can someone who was rejected and erased ever choose love again? Yes, but only if they are brave enough to set the past on fire and walk through the ash to find the person waiting on the other side. Because Kael hadn't saved me, and I hadn't saved him. We had chosen to save ourselves, together. We were the architects of a new system, a power couple that didn't need a crown to be royal. As the music began to play, a rhythmic, upbeat tune that made the floorboards vibrate, I stepped out from behind the bar and into his arms, the bond humming a song of peace that echoed through the entire territory. The rejected Omega was gone, replaced by a woman who had rewritten fate with nothing but the truth and a silver locket. And as we danced in the light of the silver moon, I knew that our story wasn't an ending, but a beginning. The world was wide, the air was clear, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the moon. I was the moon.